She brought another man into our home, then called me pathetic. They thought I'd break. That I'd quietly disappear. But instead, I watched her life collapse, piece by piece. This is the story of betrayal, and the revenge no one saw coming. The sun dipped low over a quiet neighborhood in New Hampshire, as Noah Grant pulled into the driveway of the house he had called home for 14 years. The fading light cast long shadows across the faded lawn, the porch steps creaked with a familiar rhythm, and yet nothing about this evening felt comforting. The engine shut off, but Noah remained still, staring through the windshield at the darkened windows. What waited inside was heavier than anything he had carried through a full day of lecturing disinterested students. It wasn't exhaustion from teaching that gripped him, it was the silence that had taken over his life. The kind that crept in between words never spoken and glances that once held affection, now replaced by avoidance. Lena had become distant in ways he couldn't name at first, but now, the truth had become too loud to ignore. Her boutique downtown had become a convenient excuse, a shield behind which she could disappear without accountability. Inside the house, the air was still. There was no scent of food, no hint of life. Just a handwritten note on the fridge, short, detached, and impersonal. She wasn't coming home early, and deep down, he hadn't expected her to. For months, the patterns had shifted. Late nights became the norm. Whispers behind closed doors replaced casual conversation. The woman he had once held close now moved through their shared life like a shadow. Noah sat on the couch, a cold beer in hand, and tried to occupy himself with work. Essays to grade. Lessons to review. But none of it could quiet the storm growing inside him. As midnight crept past, the sound of tires crunching on gravel sliced through the silence. He moved toward the window, cautious, unnoticed. The car that pulled in wasn't hers, it was a black, expensive model he didn't recognize. Two figures stepped out. The first was Lena, her balance unsteady, her dress askew, laughter trailing behind her like perfume. The man at her side was tall, well-built, and unmistakably confident. Derek Stone, known around town for his business empire and the trail of questionable deals behind it. His name carried weight, and not the good kind. Noah didn't need to guess. The closeness between them said more than words ever could. Her body leaned into Derek's like it had found a new home. Their entrance into the house was casual, shameless, a violation of everything sacred about the space. She called out for Noah, but it wasn't concern that laced her voice, it was mockery. He remained in the shadows as they passed him, her expression shifting from surprise to disdain the moment their eyes met. Derek's arrogance filled the room like smoke, his smirk lingering even as they moved up the stairs together, careless and bold. Noah stood frozen, watching as the woman he once loved disappeared into their bedroom with another man. Time blurred. Minutes, maybe hours, passed while he stood motionless, listening to muffled sounds that tore at what little remained of his pride. When Derek finally descended, his appearance was as careless as his presence, confident, condescending, victorious. He left without apology, offering only an insult masked as humor before stepping out into the night. Noah remained still. Lena returned briefly, standing at the top of the stairs, her robe barely clinging to her. Her words were cruel, calculated to wound. There was no shame in her tone, only contempt. She spoke as if his pain amused her, as if what had just occurred was his fault. Something shifted in Noah in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was clarity. The person standing before him was no longer the woman he had married. Whatever connection they once shared had been hollowed out, corrupted. Without raising his voice, he told her to leave. It wasn't a request, it was the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long. She scoffed, challenged him, threatened legal battles and revenge, but he stood his ground. His eyes held a calm she hadn't expected, and slowly, her bravado cracked. Within minutes she had packed a suitcase. At the doorway, her final threats echoed into the night, empty and bitter. He closed the door behind her. The silence returned, but this time, it felt different. Not empty, but open. Noah sank to the floor, his back against the door, the weight of betrayal settling over him like concrete. But as his body trembled, something else stirred beneath the surface. The hurt was real, the humiliation raw, but it wasn't all that lived inside him anymore. There was something colder now. Sharper. This wasn't the end of his story. Not by a long shot. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The days that followed Lena's departure passed in a haze of quiet intensity. Noah Grant, once a man shaped by structure and routine, now lived in the silence left behind. He woke early, taught his history classes with mechanical precision, and returned each evening to a house that echoed with absence. But beneath the surface of his mundane schedule, something far more deliberate was taking shape. His pain, raw and unresolved, had begun to calcify into focus. It wasn't about jealousy anymore. It wasn't even about heartbreak. It was about reclaiming control. About making sure that the betrayal he had suffered wouldn't go unanswered. Every moment alone became an opportunity to strategize. His evenings were spent not in front of the television but in front of a monitor, combing through records, revisiting bank statements, and tracing patterns. Years of marriage had taught him Lena's habits, and now that knowledge became a weapon. Their joint accounts showed signs he hadn't noticed before: frequent transfers, uncharacteristic spending, late-night withdrawals. She hadn't just betrayed him emotionally, she had been siphoning money from their life together while preparing her exit. But Noah didn't confront her. He said nothing. He simply documented. When classes ended each afternoon, he slipped into a role no one had assigned him, that of the quiet observer. Lena had moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, and Noah found himself driving past the building more often than necessary. He never approached, never made himself known. He simply watched. She came and went, sometimes alone, often not. One face appeared more than others: Derek Stone. The same man who had walked into Noah's house like he owned it. The same man who had made a mockery of everything Noah once held sacred. On a cold Thursday evening, Noah followed Lena to a bar on the outskirts of town. The kind of place with dim lighting and familiar regulars who didn't ask questions. He entered quietly, taking a seat near the back where shadows gathered and sidelines remained open. His drink sat untouched. Lena entered not long after, accompanied by Derek. Their interactions were far from subtle. The laughter, the touching, the whispered exchanges, it all confirmed what Noah already knew. But what he heard next pushed things beyond emotion and into dangerous clarity. As she leaned toward Derek, her voice low but not cautious, she spoke of Noah not as a person, but as an obstacle. She mocked him, his loyalty, his quiet nature, his belief that love was enough. She told Derek about her plan to bleed him dry. She had been moving funds without his knowledge. She knew how to manipulate the system, how to make herself look like the victim if things went public. Derek didn't seem surprised. He laughed, amused by the audacity of it all. But even he appeared skeptical that Lena could pull it off. Noah sat still, heart pounding, every word etching itself into his memory. By the time they left the bar, Noah had heard enough. He returned home not in anger, but with a growing sense of purpose. The emotional devastation that had once kept him frozen was gone. In its place stood a man who had nothing left to lose, and that kind of man was dangerous. The betrayal had not only shattered their marriage, it had awakened something ruthless inside him. That night, he opened her social media accounts he had helped her set up years ago and still had access to. It didn't take much to bypass her security settings. What he found confirmed everything. Dozens of messages to different men, private conversations laced with flirtation, deceit, and contempt. He sifted through her emails next, locating more damning evidence: misreported income from the boutique, communications with clients that hinted at financial mismanagement, and casual mentions of unethical practices she shared without hesitation. He copied everything, labeled it, sorted it into folders. By morning, he had constructed a digital dossier that painted a clear picture of who Lena Brooks had become: a manipulator, a liar, and someone who had underestimated the man she once married. Noah didn't act impulsively. He began slowly, testing the waters. Anonymous emails crafted with care made their way into the inboxes of key people, her friends, her sister, even her mother. The messages were simple, direct, and filled with just enough information to plant doubt. Whispers of affairs. Hints at theft. Questions no one had thought to ask. He never claimed to be the sender. He left no trace. The impact was subtle at first: a delay in text replies, fewer visits from friends, a shift in the way people interacted with her in public. In their small town, whispers didn't take long to become rumors, and rumors grew fast. Noah stayed close to the fire, listening to the heat rise but never stepping into it. When Lena's sister called him, sounding shaken, he pretended to be just as surprised. He told her he didn't want to talk about the divorce, that things were still too raw. He played the victim because, in a way, he was, but he was also the one holding the match. By the end of the week, Lena had started to notice. Her texts became more frequent. She left voicemails filled with uncertainty, asking if he had spoken to anyone, if he knew anything. Noah never replied. Silence was more powerful than confrontation. She wasn't unraveling yet, but she was beginning to feel the pull. And that was all Noah needed. The first thread had been tugged. Lena's world had always been a carefully arranged performance: fashionable posts, curated friendships, a thriving boutique in the heart of town. But now, the surface began to fracture. It started with glances that lingered too long at the grocery store. Friends who used to call every other day now sent only brief messages or avoided her entirely. The boutique, once busy with loyal customers and walk-ins, had grown strangely quiet. Foot traffic slowed, and regulars stopped showing up. Noah noticed it all. From a distance, he watched the social erosion unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a strange kind of detachment. This wasn't revenge for the sake of emotion, it was a precise operation. One rooted in justice, not fury. He told himself that repeatedly, and each day it sounded a little more convincing. He kept pushing the momentum forward. Using the financial records and emails he had collected, he crafted anonymous tips, carefully worded to raise the right kind of suspicion. A message landed in the inbox of a local tax office, outlining discrepancies in the boutique's filings. It wasn't an accusation, it was a suggestion. Enough to spark a review. Enough to create problems Lena wouldn't be able to charm her way out of. At the same time, Noah turned his attention to her customers. He identified the boutique's top spenders through her email contacts and client lists, people she had nurtured relationships with for years. He composed messages from a separate account, warning of questionable business practices, inflated prices, and poor quality imports being passed off as artisan goods. The tone was neutral, almost journalistic, as if written by someone with no personal stake. The fallout was immediate. Returns increased. Online reviews dipped subtly. A few customers shared screenshots of the anonymous warnings in local Facebook groups, stirring speculation. By the end of the week, the boutique was no longer a trendy destination, it had become a topic of concern. Noah never stepped into the spotlight. He observed, adjusted, and waited. Then the call came. It was late in the evening. He recognized Lena's number and considered letting it ring. But something in him told him it was time to hear her voice again. Her tone had changed. There was panic in it now, not arrogance. She spoke of chaos, the sudden drop in business, the cold shoulders from old friends, the growing distance even from her family. And then came the blow she hadn't seen coming, an audit notice from the IRS. She didn't ask if Noah was behind it. Not directly. She asked for his help. Pleaded, in fact. Said she didn't know where else to turn. That everything was falling apart. He listened with practiced calm, offering gentle words and just enough concern to sound authentic. He told her he wasn't sure what he could do, that things were complicated, that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. She grasped at the hope like a drowning woman. But Noah didn't offer solutions. He offered silence and space, tools far more powerful. Behind his composure, he knew the timing was perfect. Lena was vulnerable now, exposed in ways she'd never experienced before. She had built her identity around control, and now that illusion was crumbling. It was time to shift the game further. He created a new alias, a digital identity that couldn't be traced. Under this name, he began interacting in local forums, subtly spreading doubt. He didn't make direct accusations, he asked questions. Has anyone else had issues with Lena's shop? Did anyone notice her prices have gone up? Is it true the boutique's taxes were flagged? People talked. People always did. Especially in towns where secrets struggled to stay buried. The whispers turned into side eyes. Customers hesitated before walking in. Some never did. Lena, once the picture of poise and confidence, was unraveling. Noah saw it in the way she dressed when she left her apartment, less polished, more rushed. He noticed it in her posture, hunched by invisible weight. The social power she once wielded so effortlessly had vanished, replaced by a fog of suspicion. He received another voicemail from her 2 days later, her voice cracking, unsure. She didn't sound like the woman who had walked up the stairs of their home with another man. She sounded like someone barely holding on. Still, he didn't respond. Instead, he refined his strategy. He printed copies of every damning email, every bank statement, every document she thought had been erased. He wasn't ready to use them all yet, but he would be. Soon. In the meantime, he continued to play the role of the concerned ex-husband in public. He attended community events, spoke kindly about Lena when asked, shrugged gently when people speculated. It was important to look like a man still trying to heal, not the one responsible for her collapse. The irony didn't escape him. Lena had always seen herself as the one in control, the one shaping outcomes. But now, her every step was being guided by someone she had dismissed as irrelevant. Someone she had underestimated. Noah wasn't angry anymore. He had moved past that. What he felt now was clarity, a sense that everything was happening exactly as it should. The woman who had tried to destroy his life was now trapped in the ruins of her own. And he had only just begun. By the time the boutique's windows stood empty, and her once loyal clients had vanished, Lena had become a ghost in her own life. Her days were filled with frantic calls to vendors, failed attempts at reconnecting with estranged friends, and long, unproductive meetings with her accountant. Her eyes carried the weight of confusion, as if she couldn't comprehend how everything had collapsed so quickly. But Noah understood. Every moment of her downfall had been a step in a carefully drawn path, one that now led to the final obstacle, Derek Stone. Noah had never underestimated Derek. The man moved through life like a wrecking ball, charming when it suited him, dangerous when it didn't. He had become a central figure in Lena's spiral, both emotionally and practically. As long as he remained in her orbit, she would never be fully broken. There would always be someone to distract her from the consequences. That had to end. Noah began gathering evidence, not just of Derek's affair with Lena, but of the man's business dealings, financial inconsistencies, and ties to less-than-legal operations. It didn't take much effort. Derek was reckless and sloppy, and the trail of digital missteps he left behind was enough to build a case. Noah compiled contracts with suspicious clauses, messages that hinted at under-the-table arrangements, and banking activity that painted a damning picture. When the folder was complete, thick with documentation, Noah made his move. He contacted Derek directly, requesting a face-to-face meeting. The man responded with arrogant amusement, still under the illusion that he held the upper hand. When Derek arrived at Noah's house, the smirk on his face said everything. He still saw Noah as the quiet teacher, the harmless ex-husband. But the moment he stepped inside, he sensed a shift. Noah didn't waste time. He laid the folder on the coffee table between them and let Derek skim through the contents. There was no need for threats. The weight of evidence spoke louder than words. With each page turned, Derek's confidence eroded. The room grew heavier with the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. Noah laid out the terms with calm precision. Derek would end things with Lena immediately, and not with indifference, but with cruelty. He would sever the relationship in a way that left her emotionally shattered, without closure, without explanation. She needed to feel abandoned, humiliated, worthless. Only then would she be fully isolated. Derek resisted at first. But as he flipped back through the documents, calculating the cost of a legal investigation into his affairs, he understood. His ego couldn't afford exposure. He agreed, though not without bitterness. That night, Noah waited in his car, parked a block away from Lena's apartment. He watched as Derek arrived, entered, and stayed for just under an hour. The muffled sounds of shouting reached the street. Then the front door slammed, and Derek emerged, his expression grim but satisfied. As he passed Noah's car, he glanced in his direction and gave a silent nod. Noah waited a few minutes before approaching the building. The door was unlocked, slightly ajar. Inside, the apartment was dim and still. Lena sat curled on the floor near the window, her shoulders shaking. The emotional destruction was palpable. Her voice broke as she tried to speak, but Noah said nothing. He simply knelt beside her, offering a presence she didn't have the strength to question. By morning, she had moved to the couch, where she drifted in and out of sleep. Noah made coffee in her kitchen, as if it were a normal day. She stirred, disoriented, and asked why he was there. He replied calmly, saying he just wanted to make sure she was all right. She said little at first, her voice hoarse from crying. But eventually she opened up. Her words were tangled, fragments of regret, confusion, disbelief. She didn't understand why Derek had left, or how everything in her life had collapsed so fast. The boutique, the friendships, her reputation, they had all vanished like smoke. Noah listened with quiet attentiveness. He didn't comfort her with lies, nor did he reveal the truth. Instead, he gently told her that sometimes, consequences arrive all at once. That life had a way of forcing clarity on those who ignored it for too long. She wept again, not just for Derek, but for everything she had lost. And she clung to Noah. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had thrown him aside had now turned to him as her only source of stability. He played the role perfectly, offering soft reassurances, subtle support, never too much. Just enough to keep her dependent. Over the following days, he continued to stay close. He managed her errands, reviewed her finances, and offered practical help. Gradually, she began to trust him again, not out of affection, but necessity. Her world had narrowed to a single safe space, and Noah had made sure he was the only one occupying it. When he suggested she sign over the boutique's ownership to him, temporarily, to protect it from legal complications, she hesitated. Her hesitation didn't last long. He presented it as a solution, a way to preserve what little she had left. She agreed with a tired nod, too worn down to resist. The next day, the paperwork was signed. Noah walked away from the apartment holding the keys to everything she had once valued, her business, her security, and the last illusion of control she'd been clinging to. And she hadn't even realized it. Weeks passed. Lena's world had shrunk into a narrow, suffocating routine. She rarely left her apartment anymore. Shane clung to her like a second skin. The boutique, once a symbol of pride, had been signed over and liquidated. The friends who used to orbit her life had disappeared without ceremony. She moved through her days like a shadow, lost in the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. Noah had become her only connection to the outside world. Each morning he arrived with groceries or paperwork, wearing the same gentle expression. He asked how she was sleeping. He made her tea. He sat with her in silence. To anyone looking in, he was a good man doing the honorable thing, offering comfort to a broken woman who had once betrayed him. But in reality, every word, every visit was deliberate. Calculated. Measured. Lena grew more dependent with each passing day. Her confusion had morphed into desperation. The only place she felt safe now was beside the very man she had once discarded. One gray afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, she looked at Noah across the kitchen table. Her face was pale, her features thinner than he remembered. She asked if there was any chance they could start over. Her voice trembled. She spoke of regret, of wrong choices, of the pain she had caused. For a moment, Noah said nothing. Then he rose from his chair and walked to his briefcase. What came next was not forgiveness. He placed a stack of documents on the table. Divorce papers. Already signed by him. She stared at them, blinking in disbelief. Her lips parted to protest, but no words came. He calmly pulled out his phone, opening a folder of screenshots, anonymous emails, financial evidence, social media leaks. Her betrayal, broadcasted and archived. Only then did the truth begin to dawn on her. Everything that had happened, the gossip, the failing business, the audit, Derek's brutal exit, it had all been orchestrated. Not by fate. Not by karma. But by Noah. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply explained piece by piece how he had dismantled her life. How he had turned her cruelty into fuel. How he had watched, step by step, as she lost everything. Lena collapsed onto the floor, the weight of it all too much. She begged for forgiveness. Tears ran down her face. She said she hadn't meant for things to go so far. She said she still loved him. But Noah felt nothing. No pity. No warmth. Only the cold clarity of finality. He handed her a pen and pointed to the line where she was to sign. When she hesitated, he reminded her, with quiet intensity, that she had nothing left. No money. No assets. No allies. Fighting back would only prolong the inevitable. Her signature was shaky, but it landed on the paper all the same. Noah gathered the documents and placed them back in his briefcase. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the woman he had once loved. There was no trace of the woman who had laughed beside him on warm summer nights. Only someone hollow. Broken. Unrecognizable. As he stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet concrete and something else, something like freedom. The road ahead was uncertain. He hadn't thought much about what came next. But for the first time in months, he felt stillness, not the oppressive kind that had followed Lena's betrayal, but the kind that comes after a storm has passed. Noah walked to his car, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. Behind him, a chapter closed. And somewhere deep within, a new one quietly began.